The conference room at Naval Air Station Fallon buzzed with nervous energy as 42 of the military's finest aviators took their seats around the massive oak table. Captain Marcus Reaper Rodriguez had called this unprecedented meeting, and when a Navy SEAL captain with 3 Purple Hearts and countless classified missions under his belt demanded your attention, you listened. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her flight suit and found a seat in the back corner, keeping her head down as conversations swirled around her. At 28, she was one of the youngest pilots in the room, and certainly one of the few women. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her green eyes scanned the room with the quiet intensity that had become her trademark. The other aviators were easy to read. There was Commander Jake Bulldog Harrison from VFA 103, his chest heavy with ribbons from his tours over Afghanistan and Iraq. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos represented the Marines, her Harrier experience evident in the confident way she carried herself. Air Force Major Tom Viper Chen had flown more combat sorties than most people had hot dinners, and his reputation preceded him wherever he went. Sarah knew she didn't belong here, at least not in the eyes of most people in the room. Her service record was impressive but largely classified, and she'd made a career out of being underestimated. It was safer that way, easier to blend into the background and let others take the spotlight while she did what she did best. Captain Rodriguez entered the room with the purposeful stride of a man who'd spent years moving through hostile territory. His weathered face bore the marks of someone who'd seen too much combat, and his dark eyes held the kind of intensity that made hardened warriors shift uncomfortably in their chairs. He was followed by a small entourage of Pentagon officials and what looked like CIA personnel, though nobody was advertising their affiliations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. We have a situation developing in the South China Sea that requires immediate attention and the kind of precision that only comes from real combat experience." The room fell silent. Sarah noticed several pilots straightening in their chairs, their competitive instincts already kicking in. This was clearly going to be more than a routine briefing. Rodriguez activated a large display screen that showed satellite imagery of what appeared to be a heavily fortified island installation. 48 hours ago, intelligence assets confirmed that a terrorist organization has established a base of operations on this abandoned oil platform. They're holding 12 American civilians hostage, including 6 children from a missionary family. The implications hit the room like a physical force. This wasn't going to be a standard rescue operation. The platform's location, nearly 200 miles from the nearest friendly territory, meant that any rescue attempt would require exceptional flying skills and the kind of combat experience that couldn't be taught in simulators. The platform is defended by surface-to-air missiles, multiple anti-aircraft positions, and what our analysts believe to be at least 40 well-armed hostiles. Rodriguez continued. The approach will require flying at extremely low altitude through a maze of oil derricks and industrial equipment. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and those hostages die. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She'd flown missions like this before, though she couldn't discuss the details with anyone in the room. The South China Sea was particularly challenging terrain, with unpredictable weather patterns and the constant threat of enemy forces. She'd learned to navigate those waters the hard way, through trial by fire in situations that officially never happened. Rodriguez's next words sent a chill through the room. This isn't going to be a large-scale operation. We need 2 pilots, maybe 3 at most. The kind of pilots who can fly in conditions that would ground anyone else, who can make split-second decisions under fire, and who have the combat experience to handle whatever they encounter on that platform. The SEAL captain's eyes swept the room, evaluating each face with the kind of professional assessment that had kept him alive through dozens of dangerous missions. I need pilots who've been shot at and shot back, pilots who've flown through hell and brought their aircraft home, pilots who understand that sometimes the only way to save lives is to take them. Several hands started to rise around the room, but Rodriguez held up his own hand to stop them. Before anyone volunteers, let me be clear about what we're asking. This mission has a 60% survival probability under the best circumstances. The approach to that platform will require flying at less than 50 feet above the water. threading the needle between radar installations and potentially engaging multiple enemy aircraft. The room's energy shifted noticeably. Some of the raised hands lowered, and Sarah could see pilots reconsidering their eagerness to volunteer. This wasn't about glory or career advancement. This was about accepting a mission that might very well be a one-way trip. The extraction phase will be even worse, Rodriguez continued. You'll need to maintain position in a hover while under heavy fire, coordinate with ground teams in a hostile environment, and then fly out with a full load of passengers who may be wounded or traumatized. There's no backup plan if something goes wrong. Sarah found herself leaning forward slightly, her mind already calculating approach vectors and emergency protocols. She'd been in similar situations before, though she'd never been able to talk about them afterward. The classified nature of her previous missions meant that her real experience was locked away in Pentagon files that most people in this room would never see. Commander Harrison raised his hand. Sir, I've got 400 combat hours over Afghanistan. I've been shot down twice and made it home both times. Rodriguez nodded appreciatively. Impressive record, Commander. What about close air support in urban environments? Extensive experience, sir. I've provided cover for ground operations in Baghdad and Kabul. Major Chen spoke up next. Captain, I've flown more than 60 missions over Syria and Iraq. I've got experience with precision strikes and tactical extraction. Good, Rodriguez replied. What about maritime operations? Specifically, low-altitude work over open water in contested airspace? Chen hesitated slightly. Limited experience, sir. Most of my work has been over land-based targets. Rodriguez continued his systematic evaluation of the pilots, asking increasingly specific questions about combat experience and specialized skills. Sarah listened as pilot after pilot described impressive service records, but she could tell that Rodriguez wasn't finding exactly what he was looking for. The SEAL captain was looking for something specific, something that went beyond standard combat experience. He needed pilots who had operated in the gray areas, who had flown missions that never appeared in official records, who had developed the kind of instinctive skills that only came from repeatedly facing impossible situations and somehow surviving. Lieutenant Colonel Santos described her experience with vertical landing operations in hostile territory. Major Derek Falcon Williams talked about his work with Special Operations Forces in classified locations. Captain Lisa Phoenix Kumar outlined her experience with electronic warfare and radar evasion techniques. Each pilot brought impressive credentials to the table, but Rodriguez's expression remained skeptical. He was clearly looking for something more, something that none of the volunteering pilots had quite demonstrated yet. Let me ask a different question, Rodriguez said, his voice taking on a harder edge. How many of you have flown combat missions where you were outnumbered 10-1? Where your survival depended entirely on your ability to outfly and outfight multiple enemy aircraft simultaneously? The room fell silent. Several pilots shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah could see them reassessing their own experience. This wasn't about flying in support roles or conducting precision strikes against ground targets. Rodriguez was asking about air-to-air combat against overwhelming odds, the kind of fighting that separated the exceptional pilots from the merely good ones. Commander Harrison spoke up again. Sir, I've engaged enemy aircraft on multiple occasions, but typically as part of a larger formation with comprehensive support. That's honest, Rodriguez replied. What I'm describing is different. I'm talking about missions where you're alone, outnumbered, with no backup and no support, where your only advantages are your skills, your aircraft, and your willingness to do whatever it takes to complete the mission. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. She knew exactly what Rodriguez was describing because she'd lived it. She'd flown missions where the odds were so heavily stacked against success that official planners had written them off as suicide runs. She'd learned to fight and win in situations that defied conventional tactical wisdom, but those missions were classified at levels that made discussing them impossible. Her real combat record was buried so deep in Pentagon files that even she sometimes wondered if it had really happened. The medals she'd earned were locked away in a vault, the citations sealed under national security protocols that would remain in effect for decades. Rodriguez continued his questioning, becoming increasingly specific about the type of experience he was seeking. He asked about night operations in hostile airspace, about flying damaged aircraft home from impossible distances, about making combat decisions with incomplete information and no time for deliberation. With each question, more pilots fell silent. The requirements Rodriguez was describing went beyond normal combat experience into the realm of the extraordinary, the kind of flying that existed at the intersection of skill, luck, and sheer determination. Sarah remained quiet in her corner, watching the dynamics of the room shift as Rodriguez's standards became clear. She could have answered every one of his questions, could have provided exactly the kind of experience he was looking for, but doing so would mean revealing information that could land her in federal prison, breaking oaths that she'd sworn to take to her grave. The SEAL captain seemed to sense the mood of the room. His expression showed a mixture of disappointment and understanding, as if he'd expected this outcome but hoped for something different. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said finally, "I appreciate your service and your willingness to volunteer. What I'm looking for may not exist in the active duty military. The kind of experience I need might only be found in the classified world, in operations that officially never happened." Rodriguez paused, his eyes scanning the room one more time. "So let me ask one final question, and I want complete honesty. Are there any combat pilots here who have flown missions that they can't talk about? Operations so classified that their own service records don't reflect their true experience?" The room fell completely silent. Sarah felt every eye in the room, though she knew that wasn't actually the case. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her expression neutral. But inside, every instinct was telling her that this was the moment of truth. Rodriguez's question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah knew that how she responded in the next few seconds would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the lives of 12 innocent hostages who were counting on someone having the skills necessary to bring them home. The silence stretched on, and Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a physical force. She'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of situation, staying in the shadows and letting others take the credit for missions that she'd made possible. But now, with lives hanging in the balance, she had to decide whether her personal safety was more important than the chance to save others. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Sarah began to rise from her chair. The sound of Sarah's chair scraping against the floor seemed unnaturally loud in the silent conference room. Every head turned toward the back corner where she stood, her movement deliberate and controlled despite the sudden attention focused on her. Captain Rodriguez's dark eyes locked onto hers, and she saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that went beyond mere curiosity. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice respectful but probing, "do you have something to share?" Sarah took a breath, weighing her words carefully. Years of operational security training had taught her to reveal only what was absolutely necessary, but she could sense that this situation demanded more than the usual evasions. "Captain," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, "I believe I may have the experience you're looking for. However, the nature of that experience means I can't discuss specifics in an open forum." Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in details that most people would miss. He noticed the way she stood, the unconscious positioning that kept her back to the wall, and her eyes on the room's exits. He saw the slight callus on her right hand that came from thousands of hours gripping a flight stick under combat conditions. Most importantly, he recognized the calm confidence that only came from someone who had faced death repeatedly and learned to function despite the fear. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Rodriguez said, reading her name tag. "Step forward, please." As Sarah walked toward the front of the room, she was acutely aware of the other pilots watching her. Some looked curious, others skeptical. Commander Harrison's expression showed barely concealed doubt, while Major Chen seemed more open to the possibility that this relatively young pilot might have something significant to offer. Rodriguez gestured to one of the Pentagon officials, a thin man with prematurely gray hair, who had the look of someone who spent his days managing classified information. The official whispered something to Rodriguez, who nodded and then looked back at Sarah. "Lieutenant, I'm going to ask you some questions that you may not be able to answer in this setting. Just respond with yes or no where possible." Sarah nodded, understanding that this was as close to a security clearance verification as she was going to get in a room full of people who weren't read into her actual operations. "Have you flown combat missions in the South China Sea region?" Rodriguez asked. "Yes, sir." "Have you engaged enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat while operating alone and outnumbered?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment, not from uncertainty but from the weight of memories that question brought back. "Yes, sir." A murmur ran through the room. Commander Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest. "Have you successfully completed extraction operations under heavy fire in maritime environments?" "Yes, sir." Rodriguez's next question sent a chill through the room. "Have you ever flown a mission with a survival probability assessed at less than 30%? Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. "Yes, sir. Multiple times." The SEAL captain studied her face, looking for any sign of exaggeration or false bravado. What he saw instead was the kind of controlled intensity that came from surviving impossible situations through a combination of skill, planning, and sheer determination. "The specific platform we're dealing with," Rodriguez said, activating the display screen again, "is surrounded by a radar network that creates overlapping coverage zones. Standard approach vectors would be detected at least 30 miles out, giving the enemy ample time to prepare." "Have you operated in similar environments?" Sarah looked at the display, her mind automatically calculating approach angles and defensive positions. "Captain, if I may speak hypothetically, that particular platform configuration appears similar to installations I've encountered in my previous operations. The radar placement suggests vulnerability from the southwest approach vector, particularly during dawn hours when atmospheric conditions create natural interference." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. Sarah had just demonstrated intimate knowledge of advanced radar evasion techniques that weren't covered in standard pilot training. More importantly, she'd identified a tactical weakness in the enemy's defenses that none of the other pilots had noticed. Rodriguez exchanged a meaningful glance with the Pentagon official, who made a subtle gesture that Sarah recognized as approval to proceed with more detailed questions. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Rodriguez said, "I'm going to describe a tactical scenario, and I want you to tell me how you would approach it. You're flying alone, low fuel, damaged aircraft, and you need to extract a package from a hostile location while under fire from multiple directions. What's your priority sequence?" Quote, Sarah didn't hesitate. "First priority is establishing communication with the package to confirm their status and location. Second is identifying enemy positions and threat vectors to plan the optimal approach angle. Third is timing the extraction to minimize exposure, which typically means coordinating with any available distractions or natural cover." "And if there are no available distractions?" Rodriguez pressed. "Then you create them," Sarah replied. "Sometimes the best way to extract under fire is to make the enemy react to multiple threats simultaneously, even if you have to generate those threats yourself." Major Chen spoke up from his seat. "How do you generate multiple threats with a single aircraft?" Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious. "Depends on the aircraft and available ordnance. But the principle is to force the enemy to divide their attention. You might use radar jamming to create false targets, deploy flares or chaff to suggest multiple incoming aircraft, or use precision strikes to eliminate key defensive positions, while simultaneously creating confusion about your actual position and intentions." Commander Harrison was leaning forward now, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional interest. "That sounds good in theory, but how do you coordinate that level of complexity while maintaining the precision necessary for extraction operations?" "Practice," Sarah said simply. "And the understanding that in truly hostile environments, complexity isn't just helpful, it's essential for survival. The enemy expects standard tactics, so survival often depends on doing things that seem impossible or illogical from a conventional perspective." Rodriguez was studying Sarah with increasing intensity. "Lieutenant, you're describing tactics that aren't taught in any standard curriculum. Where did you learn these techniques?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Sir, I learned them from people who operate in the gray areas, in situations where conventional tactics would result in mission failure and probable death. My instructors were individuals whose experience comes from operations that officially never happened. The Pentagon official leaned over to whisper something urgently to Rodriguez, who nodded and then looked back at Sarah. "Lieutenant Mitchell, I'm going to need to verify some information before we continue. However, I want you to understand that this conversation is moving toward areas that will require additional security protocols." "I understand, sir," Sarah replied. "I'm prepared to provide whatever verification is necessary, within the constraints of my security obligations." Rodriguez activated a secure communication device and spoke quietly for several minutes. While he was talking, Sarah became aware that the other pilots were studying her with a mixture of curiosity and professional assessment. She could almost see them re-evaluating their assumptions about the quiet pilot who had been sitting in the back corner. Lieutenant Colonel Santos was the first to speak. "Mitchell, I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never heard some of the techniques you just described. What aircraft are you rated on?" "Ma'am, I'm qualified on multiple platforms, including several that aren't commonly discussed in open forums." Major Williams leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You're talking about special operations aircraft, aren't you? The kind of platforms that don't officially exist?" "Actor." Sarah's expression didn't change, but her silence was answer enough. Rodriguez finished his communication and turned back to the group. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just received authorization to discuss certain classified elements of this mission. However, before I continue, I need to establish security protocols for this room." The Pentagon official stood and activated what appeared to be an electronic jamming device. "This room is now secured against electronic surveillance. What we discuss from this point forward is classified at the TOP secret level, with additional compartmentalized access restrictions." Sarah felt a familiar sense of relief as the security protocols engaged. For years, she'd been forced to hide the true extent of her experience, to downplay her capabilities and accept assignments that were far below her actual skill level. Now, finally, she might be able to operate at her full potential. Rodriguez looked around the room. "I'm going to be direct with all of you. The mission I described earlier isn't just dangerous, it's what we call a black operation. It exists in the space between official military action and plausible deniability. The pilots who fly this mission will be operating under cover identities, with aircraft that can't be traced back to U.S. forces." The implications hit the room like a physical force. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a covert operation that would exist in the same shadow world where Sarah had spent most of her career. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Rodriguez continued, "based on the verification I just received, you have experience with exactly this type of operation. According to certain very classified files, you've successfully completed multiple missions under similar parameters." Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir, I have." "Then I have a proposition for you," Rodriguez said. "I want you to lead this mission. Not as a subordinate pilot, but as the mission commander. Your experience in covert operations makes you uniquely qualified to handle the complexities we're going to face." Commander Harrison stood up, his face flushed with indignation. "Captain, with all due respect, I've got more flight time and combat experience than anyone else in this room. I should be leading this mission." Rodriguez turned to face Harrison, his expression hard. "Commander, how many hostage extractions have you conducted from oil platforms in hostile waters while maintaining operational security that protects national interests?" Harrison's mouth opened and then closed again. "Sir, I don't have experience with that specific scenario. Lieutenant Mitchell does," Rodriguez said flatly. "According to the files I just reviewed, she's conducted 3 similar operations over the past 5 years. All successful. All without compromising U.S. involvement." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Sarah remained standing quietly, but she could feel the shift in how the other pilots were looking at her. She was no longer the young, inexperienced pilot they'd dismissed. She was someone with a track record of success in the most dangerous operations the military conducted. Rodriguez held up a hand for silence. "This brings me to the real reason for this meeting. The mission I described isn't just about rescuing hostages. It's about sending a message to terrorist organizations that American citizens are off limits. Regardless of where they're taken or how well defended their captors believed themselves to be. Sarah understood the implications immediately. This wasn't just about 12 hostages. It was about demonstrating American capability to project power into any environment, under any circumstances. The success of this mission would serve as a deterrent to future hostage-taking operations. The political ramifications of this mission are complex, Rodriguez continued. If we succeed, we save American lives and demonstrate our capabilities to potential enemies. If we fail, we not only lose those hostages but potentially create an international incident that could destabilize the entire region. Major Chen raised his hand. Captain, what kind of support will we have for this operation? Minimal, Rodriguez replied bluntly. The covert nature of this mission means we can't rely on standard military support structures. You'll have access to specialized aircraft and equipment, but once you're airborne, you're essentially on your own until the extraction is complete. Sarah stepped forward. Sir, I'd like to understand the full scope of the opposition we're facing. You mentioned surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft positions, but what about enemy air assets? Rodriguez activated the display screen again, showing more detailed intelligence imagery. Intelligence suggests they have access to at least 2 combat aircraft, probably older Soviet-era fighters, but still dangerous in the right hands. Additionally, they've positioned mobile missile batteries around the platform that can engage targets at multiple altitudes. Sarah studied the display carefully, her mind automatically calculating approach vectors and engagement priorities. Captain, the enemy's defensive positioning suggests they're expecting a conventional assault. Their radar coverage and missile placement are optimized to counter standard military tactics. Exactly, Rodriguez said. Which is why we need someone with unconventional experience. Someone who can think outside the parameters of standard military doctrine. Raced. Also Class 3, Doc. Also Class 3. Lieutenant Colonel Santos spoke up. Mitchell, what would your approach be to this scenario? Sarah looked at the display for another moment, then turned to face the room. Ma'am, I'd approach it as a 3-phase operation. First, we neutralize their early warning systems using electronic warfare techniques that make our approach appear to be natural atmospheric phenomena. Second, we eliminate their mobile defensive assets through precision strikes that appear to be equipment malfunctions rather than enemy action. Third, we conduct the actual extraction while maintaining the illusion that we're something other than a rescue operation. The room fell silent as the other pilots processed the sophistication of Sarah's tactical thinking. What she was describing went far beyond standard combat tactics. It was the kind of multi-layered operational planning that existed at the intersection of military science and psychological warfare. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since the meeting began. Lieutenant Mitchell, that's exactly the kind of thinking we need for this mission. Are you prepared to take command of this operation? 18 hours after accepting command of the mission, Sarah found herself in the cockpit of an aircraft that officially didn't exist. The modified stealth helicopter bore no identifying markings and incorporated technology that was decades ahead of anything in the public military inventory. Its radar signature was virtually non-existent, and its sound-dampening systems made it nearly silent even at full power. Beside her, Major Chen sat in the co-pilot seat, his expression a mixture of nervous energy and professional focus. Behind them, a 6-man team of Navy SEALs, led by Captain Rodriguez, prepared their equipment for what everyone knew would be the most dangerous phase of the operation. Ghost 1, this is Control, came the voice in Sarah's headset. Weather conditions are optimal. Target area shows normal activity patterns. You are cleared for approach. Sarah keyed her microphone. Control, Ghost 1. Beginning approach phase. ETA to target. 47 minutes. She pushed the aircraft into a descent that would take them to less than 30 feet above the ocean's surface, well below most radar detection capabilities. The South China Sea stretched endlessly in all directions, its dark waters reflecting the pre-dawn stars. In the distance, she could see the faint lights of commercial shipping. But their route had been carefully planned to avoid any witnesses to their passage. Chen, Sarah said over the intercom, begin electronic warfare protocols. I want their radar systems seeing ghosts for the next 20 minutes. Major Chen activated a sophisticated jamming system that would create false radar returns across a wide area, making their actual approach vector impossible to distinguish from the electronic noise. To enemy operators, it would appear as if atmospheric conditions were creating unusual radar interference, nothing more than a natural phenomenon that occurred regularly in these waters. Behind them, Rodriguez and his team conducted final equipment checks. Each SEAL carried specialized gear for what was essentially a vertical assault on a fortified position. Their weapons were suppressed, their body armor designed for maximum mobility, and their communication systems encrypted at levels that made interception virtually impossible. Ghost 1. Control. Intelligence update shows 12 hostages confirmed alive and being held in the platform's main structure. Enemy strength estimated at 42 hostiles, with heavy weapons and anti-aircraft capability. Sarah processed the information while adjusting her flight path to avoid a merchant vessel that appeared on her thermal imaging system. Control, Ghost 1. Any change in enemy alert status? Negative, Ghost 1. Target appears unaware of your approach. 20 minutes later, Sarah could see the oil platform on her forward-looking infrared display. The structure was larger than she'd expected, with multiple levels and a complex arrangement of drilling equipment, storage tanks, and defensive positions. Enemy personnel were visible as heat signatures moving around the platform, but their movements appeared routine rather than alert. Chen, kill the jamming systems, Sarah ordered. From this point forward, we're invisible to their electronics. Jamming systems offline, Chen confirmed. All defensive measures now passive. Sarah studied the platform's defensive layout through her night vision systems. The enemy had positioned their anti-aircraft weapons to cover the most obvious approach vectors, but they'd made a critical error in their planning. They were thinking like conventional military forces, not like someone who had spent years operating in the spaces between official doctrine and practical reality. Rodriguez, Sarah said over the intercom, I'm going to position us for insertion using what they'll think is a equipment malfunction. Explain, Rodriguez replied. Sarah banked the helicopter toward the platform's northwestern edge, where a massive crane structure created a blind spot in the enemy's defensive coverage. I'm going to simulate a civilian helicopter that's lost navigation and is seeking emergency landing clearance. By the time they realize what's happening, you'll be on target, and I'll have neutralized their air defenses. It was an audacious plan that relied on split-second timing and the enemy's natural tendency to hesitate when confronted with an unexpected situation. Sarah activated a standard civilian transponder code and began transmitting on international emergency frequencies. Oil platform. Oil platform. This is civilian helicopter requesting emergency landing clearance. We have navigation failure and low fuel. Please advise landing procedures. The response came immediately, in accented English. Unknown helicopter. You are in restricted airspace. Turn away immediately, or we will shoot you down. Sarah continued her approach, now close enough to see individual personnel on the platform. Oil platform. We cannot comply. We have engine problems and must land immediately. We are declaring an emergency. She could see enemy personnel running toward defensive positions, but their movements showed confusion rather than coordinated response. They were dealing with what appeared to be a civilian aircraft in distress, and their training hadn't prepared them for this specific scenario. Chen, prepare targeting systems, Sarah ordered. When I give the signal, I want simultaneous strikes on positions Alpha through Delta. Targeting systems ready, Chen confirmed. All hostile positions are locked. Sarah brought the helicopter to a hover directly above the platform, close enough that enemy personnel could see into the cockpit if they looked up. To them, she appeared to be exactly what she was claiming. A civilian pilot struggling to control a damaged aircraft. Now, 4 precision missiles streaked from concealed launchers on the helicopter's fuselage, each one guided by laser targeting that painted enemy defensive positions with invisible infrared markers. The strikes were so precise and so simultaneous that the explosions seemed to occur at exactly the same moment, creating a devastating barrage that eliminated the platform's primary anti-aircraft defenses in less than 3 seconds. Before the sound of the explosions had faded, Rodriguez and his team were rappelling from the helicopter onto the platform's main deck. Sarah immediately pulled back to a defensive position. keeping the aircraft in constant motion while providing overwatch for the ground team. Ghost 1. This is Rodriguez. We're on target. Beginning hostage extraction. Through her thermal imaging system, Sarah could see the SEALs moving through the platform's structure with devastating efficiency. Their night vision equipment and specialized training gave them an overwhelming advantage in close-quarters combat. But Sarah knew that the real challenge would come during the extraction phase. Rodriguez, be advised. I'm showing 2 aircraft approaching from the northeast. ETA approximately 8 minutes. Copy, Ghost 1. We need 5 more minutes to reach the hostages. Sarah studied the incoming aircraft on her radar display. They were older Soviet-era fighters, but still capable of causing serious problems if they reached the engagement area. She had to buy the ground team those 5 minutes, which meant engaging 2 enemy aircraft while maintaining position to support the extraction operation. Chen, transfer all weapons control to pilot station. Prepare for air-to-air engagement. Weapons control transferred, Chen replied. Are you seriously planning to fight 2 enemy fighters while hovering over an oil platform? Sarah smiled grimly. No. I'm planning to convince them to fight each other while I disappear. She activated electronic warfare systems that would create multiple false targets on enemy radar, making it appear as if a small formation of aircraft was approaching the platform from several directions. At the same time, she repositioned the helicopter behind the platform's massive superstructure, using the metal framework as both physical cover and radar camouflage. Ghost 1. This is Rodriguez. We've located the hostages. All 12 are alive, but 3 need medical attention. Beginning movement to extraction point. Roger, Rodriguez. Enemy aircraft are 2 minutes out. Sarah watched her radar display as the 2 enemy fighters separated, each one pursuing what they believed were different targets. The electronic warfare systems were projecting false radar returns that appeared to be attack aircraft approaching from opposite directions, forcing the enemy pilots to divide their attention and firepower. The first enemy fighter passed directly overhead, its pilot completely unaware that Sarah's helicopter was hidden beneath him. The second fighter was pursuing a false target to the south, his radar locked onto electronic ghosts that existed only in the electromagnetic spectrum. Rodriguez, status report. Ghost 1. We're moving the hostages to extraction point. 2 minutes to your position. Sarah could see the SEALs and their charges moving across the platform's deck through her thermal imaging system. 3 of the hostages were being carried by team members, and the entire group was moving more slowly than optimal. If the enemy fighters realized they'd been deceived and returned to the platform, the extraction would become a massacre. Chen, prepare countermeasures. We're about to become very visible. Countermeasures ready. Chaff and flare systems armed. The first SEAL reached the extraction point just as one of the enemy fighters completed his turn and began heading back toward the platform. His pilot had apparently realized that he was chasing false targets and was returning to investigate the actual situation. Rodriguez, you need to move faster. We've got company coming back. 30 seconds, Ghost 1. The children are scared and moving slowly. Sarah made a split-second decision that went against every principle of tactical aviation. Instead of maintaining her defensive position, she brought the helicopter out from behind the platform's superstructure and climbed to an altitude that made her visible to both approaching enemy fighters. What are you doing? Chen demanded. Giving them a target they can't ignore, Sarah replied. The enemy fighters immediately turned toward her position, their radar systems locking onto what appeared to be a lone helicopter operating without support. To them, she represented an easy target, a mistake that would allow them to score a quick victory before returning to defend the platform. Sarah waited until both fighters committed to their attack runs, then activated every electronic warfare system the helicopter possessed. Chaff and flares filled the air around her aircraft, creating a cloud of confusion that made accurate targeting impossible. At the same time, she began an evasive maneuver that pushed the helicopter's systems to their absolute limits. The first fighter's missiles passed harmlessly through the chaff cloud, their guidance systems confused by the electromagnetic interference. The second fighter held his fire, trying to get a cleaner shot, but Sarah was already moving into the next phase of her plan. She dove toward the ocean's surface, pulling out of the descent at less than 20 feet above the water. The enemy fighters followed, but their larger aircraft couldn't match the helicopter's agility at such low altitude. More importantly, their attention was now completely focused on her, rather than on the extraction operation taking place on the platform. Rodriguez, status? Ghost 1. All hostages are aboard. We're ready for extraction. Sarah immediately reversed course, climbing rapidly while maintaining maximum evasive maneuvers. The enemy fighters were still pursuing her, but their position relative to the platform meant they couldn't fire without risking damage to their own forces. She reached the platform just as Rodriguez and the last SEAL member climbed aboard. 3 of the hostages were unconscious, several others were crying, and all of them showed signs of prolonged captivity and abuse. But they were alive. And that was all that mattered. All personnel aboard, Rodriguez reported. Let's get out of here. Sarah didn't need encouragement. She pushed the helicopter to maximum speed while activating every defensive system available. Behind them, the enemy fighters were climbing to pursue, but they were too late. The helicopter's superior acceleration and electronic warfare capabilities gave it a decisive advantage in the escape phase. Ghost 1. This is Control. Extraction successful. Vector to recovery coordinates. 20 minutes later, Sarah set the helicopter down on the deck of a ship that officially didn't exist in any naval registry. Medical personnel were waiting to treat the hostages, while intelligence specialists prepared to debrief Rodriguez and his team. As Sarah shut down the aircraft systems, she felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and relief that followed successful completion of an impossible mission. Around her, the rescued hostages were being carried to medical facilities, while Rodriguez supervised the unloading of equipment and the securing of sensitive materials. Captain Rodriguez approached her as she climbed out of the helicopter. His expression showed the kind of professional respect that could only be earned through successful completion of a mission that most people would have considered suicide. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "That was the finest piece of flying I've ever witnessed. You saved 12 American lives today, and you did it with a precision and creativity that I've never seen matched." Sarah shook his hand, feeling genuinely modest about the praise. "Thank you, sir. It was a team effort." "No," Rodriguez said firmly. "It was extraordinary individual skill applied to an impossible situation. What you did out there, fighting 2 enemy aircraft while conducting a hostage extraction, goes beyond anything in the tactical manual." Major Chen approached, still wearing his flight gear but carrying the expression of someone who had just witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about combat aviation. "Mitchell," he said, "I've been flying for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. How did you learn to fly like that?" Sarah considered her response carefully. Even with the mission complete and the hostages safe, there were still operational security considerations that limited what she could discuss. "Major," she said finally, "I learned from people who operate in situations where standard tactics result in failure. Everything you saw today came from training and experience that exists in the gray areas between official doctrine and practical necessity." Rodriguez nodded, understanding. "Lieutenant, when this mission is officially debriefed, your performance is going to be studied at the highest levels of military aviation. What you accomplished today is going to change how we think about special operations flying." Commander Harrison, who had been part of the support team during the mission, approached the group. His earlier skepticism had been completely replaced by professional admiration. "Mitchell," he said, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on incomplete information. What you did tonight demonstrated skills that I didn't even know existed." Sarah appreciated the honesty behind his words. "Commander, we all make judgments based on available information. What matters is that we were able to complete the mission successfully." Lieutenant Colonel Santos, who had monitored the mission from the command center, joined the group. "Sarah, I've been watching military aviation for 20 years, and I've never seen a single pilot successfully engage multiple enemy fighters while simultaneously conducting a precision extraction operation. How is that even possible?" "Ma'am," Sarah replied, "it's possible because sometimes the most dangerous situations require solutions that exist outside conventional thinking. The tactics I used tonight were developed by people who understood that survival often depends on doing the unexpected." Rodriguez looked around the group of pilots, all of whom were staring at Sarah with expressions of amazement and respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you witnessed tonight is why we asked that question in the conference room. Lieutenant Mitchell represents a level of capability that exists in the classified world, where pilots develop skills that go far beyond standard training." He turned back to Sarah. "Lieutenant, I want you to know that this mission's success has implications far beyond the 12 hostages we rescued tonight. What you accomplished sends a message to terrorist organizations around the world that American citizens are protected by capabilities they can't imagine and can't defend against." Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility, understanding that her actions tonight would serve as a deterrent to future hostage-taking operations. But more immediately, she felt satisfaction at having used her skills to save innocent lives and prove that the training she'd received in the shadow world of classified operations had practical value in protecting American interests. As medical personnel finished treating the hostages and prepared them for transport to advanced medical facilities, Sarah watched the reunion of the missionary family. The children clung to their parents, while the adults showed the kind of profound relief that comes from surviving a situation they'd thought was hopeless. "You know," Rodriguez said quietly, "in all my years of special operations, I've learned that the most important missions aren't always the ones that make headlines. Sometimes the most significant victories are the ones that prevent tragedies from occurring." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Tonight's mission would never be publicly acknowledged, the hostages would never know her name, and the aircraft she'd flown would disappear back into the classified world from which it had emerged. But 12 American citizens were alive because she'd been willing to rise from her chair and accept a responsibility that few people could have handled. Major Chen spoke up again. "Mitchell, I have to ask, what happens now? Do you go back to flying routine missions and pretending that you're just another pilot?" Sarah smiled at the question. "Major, that depends on whether the military is ready to acknowledge that there are capabilities available in the classified world that could benefit conventional operations. Tonight proved that unconventional training and experience can solve problems that standard doctrine can't handle." Rodriguez exchanged a meaningful glance with the Pentagon official who had been part of the original briefing. "Lieutenant Mitchell, I have a feeling that your days of hiding your capabilities are coming to an end. What you accomplished tonight is going to open doors that have been closed for a very long time." As the ship began its journey back to friendly waters, Sarah looked out over the South China Sea where, just hours before, she had proven that sometimes the quiet ones in the back of the room are the ones with the most dangerous skills. The SEAL captain's question had changed everything, forcing her out of the shadows and into a role where her true capabilities could finally be recognized and utilized. She thought about the other pilots who had been in that conference room, all of them accomplished aviators who had volunteered for what they knew was a dangerous mission. But when the moment came that required truly extraordinary skills, it had been the pilot with the classified background who had made the difference between success and failure. The mission was complete, the hostages were safe, and Sarah Mitchell had finally stepped out of the shadows to prove that sometimes the most lethal warriors are the ones who spend their careers being underestimated. Sarah looked around the room at the other pilots, all of whom were staring at her with expressions ranging from respect to amazement. She thought about the hostages waiting on that platform, about the message this mission would send to America's enemies, and about the opportunity to finally operate at her full potential. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I'm ready."